Hello and welcome to Archive West Texas on Classical 105.7. I'm your host, Gordon Wilkerson, joined as always by our producer, Rachel Boyd. On this program, we visit with the people who have shaped the history, culture, and business life of our region. We focus on their stories and accomplishments, but we also look for inspiration, lessons in leadership, service, perseverance, and community that can guide the next generation. Our guest today is former Lubbock Mayor Alan Henry. We're continuing our conversation today regarding Congressman George Mahon. Alan, as we talked about, you're one of the few people to actually ever work with the congressman. Tell us how you came to that position and how you had that opportunity.
Well, it was, I guess, luck more than anything else. I had been active in several organizations at Texas Tech. I guess the thing that I was able to do and enjoyed the most was I served as community ambassador. Back in those days, the Chamber of Commerce sent a young person to a different country each year to learn about that country and to live with a family. And so the Chamber of Commerce had this community ambassador program, and it was very competitive, and I was able to be appointed the community ambassador and spent the summer in Argentina. Back in those days, this was in the early 60s, people didn't travel as much. And so in order to pay for my trip, I gave slideshows to the people don't know what slides are. That's before it was video or anything else, but a lot of people say what the first slide is and the second slide is. But at any rate, I gave over 100 of those talks to women's clubs, men's clubs, civic clubs, whatever, and was able to see a lot of Lubbock and become reasonably well known at that point. So when Mr. Mahon was looking for someone, he called Jean Jenkins, who was she was the director of the personnel office at Texas Tech, to the placement service is what it was called. And said, Gene, I'm looking for a young man that has some potential that might come up here. And so I had known Jean off and on, but she was nice enough to recommend me as someone he might be interested in. Back in those days, and I hate to start sentences about back in those days, but occasionally it works.
It's appropriate.
But Congress actually was not in session nearly as long as it is now. And Congress would adjourn in August or at the latest September. And Mr. and Mrs. Mahon maintained an apartment here in Lubbock. And it was actually the apartment house is still there. It's the Kentwood Apartments, about 26th and Avenue Q. And so while they were in Lubbock, I went over and interviewed with him and with both of them. And they asked me about myself. And at any rate, I told them I would love to have that opportunity. Well, I didn't hear anything for months and months and months. And so the spring came around and I was finishing up a master's degree in industrial management. I was interviewing and had actually been offered and accepted a job with Pittsburgh Plate Glass in Corpus Christi. It was a kind of a dismal place, but they paid, and so I was able to do that. So just as I was getting packed up, ready to go to Corpus Christi, Mr. Mahon called one morning, about 7 o'clock in the morning, said, "This is George Mahon. Wonder if you'd like to come up to Washington and work for me." I said, "Mr. Mahon, I would love to do that." So I called. There were no contracts, and I went and told Pittsburgh Plate Glass, "Thank you, I really appreciate the offer." But so I headed up to Washington.
Describe the office when you got there. What was Washington like in the early 60s?
Well, for Mr. Mahon, the office was great because, of course, he had his choice of offices in the new Rayburn office building, and he had just moved into that. The interesting thing about the entire Washington congressional setup was how limited it was compared to what it is now. At the time that I went to Washington and worked for Mr. Mahon, that was a spring of 1965. He only had about 8 employees in his office. I was the only full-time male employee that he had. Now, as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, he had an Appropriations Committee staff, but it was very collegial atmosphere. Everybody worked long hours, and so you really didn't have much time off duty to make friends or do things. So everybody pretty much was limited their experiences to other people in Congress.
We're talking about a period with no cell phones, no email, no texts.
Right.
So talk about handling phone calls and handling mail.
Well, as you say, this was before there were any computers. It was before there was any email. And so it was all telephone. Occasionally we would get a telegram. He would get a telegram. But the procedure would be someone would call to talk to Mr. Mahon, and he would get on and have a conversation with them. And most of these calls would be, once again, asking for help. Now, keep in mind, this was during the Vietnam War, and it was just ramping up. And so there were calls about service members. There were calls about Social Security. And he would listen and would take notes. But he would have one of his staff people. We would be on an extension. And so we would be writing all the notes and everything. And he would say, well, Mrs. Jones, thank you for calling. I'm so sorry for your problem, and we'll get to work on it. Well, he would hang up, and then that staff person, it was up to them. He didn't come around and say, now I need you to do this, and yes. It was up to the staff person to know where to go. And so we would start what we called a case. Well, it was casework. And I assume it's still done similarly now. I don't know. But I had my own cases, and we had a tickler file that we would check up. For example, if someone called and had a problem with the VA, there were liaison people in the VA that we would contact, and they would get us the answer. We would put it in a letter, get the letter to Mr. Mahon, and if he liked the letter, he would sign it. There were times that he didn't approve of the letter. And the way that happened is when he came in, we would do the correspondence during the day. And when he came in after the session, it'd be 6 or 7 at night, and all of his letters for that day would be there. And so he would read each letter. And he would either sign the letter or he would tear the corner off of the letter and send it back. And so that was very interesting the way that was handled. I might mention that in working with Mr. Mahon, as far as his communication were concerned, he taught me so very, very, very much. I was as green as a gourd when I went up there, and I didn't really know any protocol. So one of the first days I was there, he said, I'd like you to talk to Senator Stennis. Well, Senator Stennis was one of the most powerful people in Washington. So I called the number, and I said, this is Mr. Mahon's, is Chairman Stennis in? And Mr. Mahon said, give me that phone. And he said, George Mahon calling Senator Stennis. And he gave it back. He says, they'll find him. And they did.
Yes, that's a great story. Alan, you've talked about how you got to Congressman Mahon's office and how he handled his communications, and a little bit even about how he worked with other members of Congress. How did he balance the work he was doing for the nation with the work he was doing for West Texas? And how did his influence in Washington translate into West Texas projects? Well,
that's a very good question. Of course, the way he stayed in office for 44 years was putting the interest of West Texas right up there with his other responsibilities. But the way that worked was that as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, I think I mentioned he had a good sized staff that worked on the appropriation side, on legislation, on those sorts of things. And then the office I worked in was his personal office, and that was for the benefit of West Texas. So he would divide his time between the appropriations office and his personal office. So he always put West Texas visitors ahead of nearly anybody. And in fact, I could remember one time I came into the office, and the Secretary of Defense McNamara was sitting out in the waiting room with everybody else, and Mr. Mahon had an appointment with him, but somebody from I forget, maybe Levelland had come in, and he saw them first. And many times one of my other jobs was to take people, on tours. And if Mr. Mahon was not in the office, but was over at the Capitol, he'd just say, bring them over. So I would take them over. He'd be in a committee meeting, and someone would tell him that the Smiths were here with Allen Henry, and he'd say, we're adjourned. He would come out. And so this is the kind of rapport. And it was genuine. It was genuine that he never forgot who sent him up there.
He was responsible at some level for funding for Reese Air Force Base.
Yes.
And for Interstate 27.
Yes.
For, I'm sure, countless other projects that I'm not thinking of. Tell us a little bit about some of those.
Right. The Reese Air Force Base, of course, he actually got it open, along with Webb Air Force Base and a couple of others in the early days of World War II. And so as long as Mr. Mahon was around, Reese Air Force Base was the premier training facility. Reese Air Force Base always got the most up-to-date training facilities, radar, all of those things, because Mr. Mahon was able to get it done. And so we were in great shape until Mr. Mahon was no longer in office, and the Clintons came into office, and they could look around and see there were not many Clinton votes in West Texas. So we put up a valiant fight not to have Reese Air Force Base closed, but it didn't work. I'd like to, that's just another little story I think you'd be interested in, because you were talking about Interstate 27. And this is a very interesting story. When the original interstate system was set up, and it was under the Eisenhower administration, Lubbock was not included. And so we had I-10 and I-20, I-10 through Amarillo going east-west, I-20 through Middle and Odessa area going east-west. But Lubbock was sort of off by itself, and there was the Chamber of Commerce, everybody was up in arms, but there was nothing they could do about it except when they talked to George Mahon was very much aware of it. And I'll never forget, this was I was in a call with Mr. Mahon shortly after Lyndon Johnson was elected. And he said, Mr. President, I will not be the congressman for the largest city in the nation that's not on an interstate system. We need to fix that. So here's how they did it. There had been an allocation of mileage for each state for the interstate system. And this had pretty much been allocated out. Each state had so many miles. And so when the president got involved, what happened was the highway folks went back and found bits and pieces of mileage that had not been used. So they took 8 miles from Ohio, 23 miles from Michigan, whatever, and they pieced together enough to get an interstate. If you look at the map, it starts at Amarillo and ends at Lubbock. And they pieced together enough to get Lubbock on the interstate. And that is how that happened. Now, I hasten to say that the state people were very important. Others were very influential. But the fact that we had George Mahon and Lyndon Johnson at that particular time is, in my opinion, the reason we got that interstate.
What other projects did he have influence on?
He was very interested in agriculture, and so he was able to get classing offices. They're not something that people know about very much, but he helped a lot in agriculture. The main way that he helped us was after the tornado. He was able to get a lot of help from the federal government, and that was the time that we had the new airport terminal. We had the Civic Center that was built at that time. We had any number of projects that had to do with the offshoot of the tornado, and Mr. Mahon was right in the middle of all that.
Redevelopment following the storm.
Right.
What do you remember about the library and how that became to be named?
Okay, well, that's another very interesting story because, as I told you, Mrs. Mahon was involved in everything that Mr. Mahon was, and at his request. And so there was very little recognition of Mrs. Mahon. So once again, the current Mahon Library was built as an adjunct of the Civic Center. And I was at the groundbreaking for that. And so were Mr. and Mrs. Mahon. And so when he discovered that they were going to call it the George and Helen Mahon Library, he was very happy and very, very proud of that. But it was just in recognition of his service and what he had been doing, especially to secure funding after the tornado.
A very appropriate naming and a true contribution to this community. Alan, what was it about Congressman Mahon's character? What personal qualities allowed him to gain the trust of so many colleagues in both parties in Washington?
He just was someone who was believable. He was a real person. He had the side that was the strict side, the very legalistic side, but he was a fun person to be around. The first morning that I worked for him, I was in Washington. It was a bright sunny morning, and he says, "Alan, we're going to go for a walk." So I said, "Okay." So we walked across to the lawn of the Capitol, right across the street. And he said, "We are looking for buckeyes." He said, "These trees, you see those?" He said, "Beneath those trees, you'll find a really shiny nut. And it's called a buckeye." He said, "I carry those and hand them out to people. So I need you to help me find some buckeyes." So here was a guy that had been up there one day, and the chairman of the Appropriations Committee walking around looking for buckeyes. And he says, "This reminds me of a poem." He says, "The lark is up to greet the sun. The bee is on the wing. The ant its labor has begun. The woods with rapture sing." That was the first thing he taught me. And incidentally, he also wrote some very nice poetry, which is in this book. It's a long way to answer your question of he was just someone you felt comfortable with and then you trusted, whether you were the president or whether you were another member of Congress or whether you were a kid from West Texas looking for buckeyes.
What would you say his most enduring legacy is?
I think his most enduring legacy was initiated and contributing to a time of growth and of hospitality and a time that no longer exists, I guess. I'm not sure exactly how to say that, but it doesn't matter how long he was up there, he was the same person. And nobody else that I've ever known of could say that. So he was very forward thinking. He always thought about West Texas, and he always worked at funding whatever he could and doing whatever he could for Lubbock. But people don't remember him for that. They remember him for being, people called him George, So I think that his legacy, as far as I'm concerned, was those relationships that he established for himself, but also for Lubbock. And I think the fact that he was so well regarded throughout Congress, which meant throughout the country, went such a long way to getting Lubbock on the map as far as an important town. And I don't think he will ever get that much recognition for that. It was just a byproduct of the kind of man that he was.
To put it in perspective, he served 22 terms in Congress.
Yes.
44 years.
Correct.
If you were a kid like I was in the 60s, the Dallas Cowboys had one football coach for their history, and that was Tom Landry, and the 19th District had one representative since it was started, and that was George Mahon. Right. Those were not certainties, but they felt like it.
That's exactly right.
To your point, I had one experience with him as a young man. I was in my mid-20s, and I'd just come back here to work, and I think it was right after the dedication of some building at Tech, or he and Helen had been honored for some reason at Texas Tech, and they needed a ride to Colorado City, and nobody had time to drive them down there. So my dad volunteered his car, and I got to drive the Mahons from Tech back to their home in Colorado City.
Oh, how neat.
And so I had 90 minutes in the car with him, and I'm thinking, this guy was involved in the Manhattan Project. He's been in Congress for 44 years. He knows so much. But we got to Colorado City. He said, would you like to go to lunch with us? And we walked into this diner, and it was just like you said, George. We're sitting with 8 of their friends, and I take them to their home, and it's a wood-framed house.
Yes.
That I guess they'd lived in for 50 years.
Well, they bought the house and lived there for a good while, and then maintained it throughout that 44 years. Yeah.
And, they're in their late 80s, and I carry their bags in, I carry them upstairs, and they say, thank you very much. And the contrast between the power is not the right word, the respect. That he earned and that he maintained in Washington, juxtaposed with the simplicity of the family and the community. I just think it was a wonderful mix, and I think one led to the other. And I think that's, like you said, maybe that's a day gone by, but that's a quality that I saw as a young man and a politician that you just do not see in, to me, that exemplified true servant leadership.
Well, you're just very perceptive. I agree completely. It was more the man and his characteristics than anything else. He was just as comfortable with his staff. As I mentioned, we had a very small staff. I didn't mention to you that at that time, he didn't even have a local office, except he used an office in the federal building between sessions. So he had one part-time person in Lubbock, and that was it. But he and Mrs. Mahon would invite the staff out to his home, and they had this wonderful apartment that overlooked Washington, still there, the Prospect House. And we would watch the Connies, as Ms. Mahon called them, the constellations, those propeller-driven planes would come in one after another at night, and it was just awe-inspiring. That was just him and Mrs. Mahon.
Yeah. What lessons from Congressman Mahon's life and career do you think might still inspire public servants today? What can we learn from him?
Well, I think what I learned was persistence. Figure out what it is you'd like to do, and then figure out a way to do it. Another one of those little meetings he had with me, and I think he just kind of took me under his wing and saw that I've had some possibilities, but I needed some polishing. He said, I want to tell you about how you need to get things done, Alan. He said, you need to be like a person who wants to get into a house, and he'll try the front door and it's locked. He'll go to the back door and it's locked. So he'll go through a window, but he'll get in that house. And he said, that's what you've got to do. You've got to, if it doesn't work the first time, figure out a way to do it. And that has helped me as much as anything else because it's against my nature. You know, we always everybody to like us, you know. But if you got a goal, you know, you have to do what it takes to get to that goal. So he just inspired that kind of interest.
He was a paradigm of loyalty to his constituents.
Yes.
And the persistence that you're talking about.
Right.
Alan, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for taking time to share your perspectives to help our listeners understand better the life and legacy of Congressman Mahon. I want to thank each of you for listening. If you know someone whose story we should share, please email your suggestion to us at info@classical1057.org. Please join us again for another episode of Archive West Texas. Thanks again for listening.